So this one idea that came from Ansel Keys was like setting off an atom bomb in our health, and it has changed the course of history for human health.
Ultimately, over 65,000 people were tested on his hypothesis. Does saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease? And in none of those experiments could they show that to be true. None of the results supported his hypothesis.
I loved the idea of some non-toxic way to impact cancer. I think it just really interested me from that personal perspective, and I thought this is really cool if it works.
We used to call him God at Baylor, Michael DeBakey himself, and he said the average cholesterol value of a patient in my operating room is 188. So it can't be about cholesterol.
And this was in early 90s.
So even then we had some clues that it wasn't about fat.
Obesity is now the greatest source of inflammation in our body, and inflammation is the common factor of cancer, heart disease, stroke, Alzheimer's disease, and diabetes and others. So the question is, how did we get to the point where 2/3 of our society is overweight or obese? You know, what happened?
I suffered from eczema when I was a little girl, so I've been on a health journey. My entire life is dedicated to how can I improve my own health and how can I share that information with other people.
Welcome and thank you so much for joining us for what is the first of a 9-part series called The Real Skinny on Fat, The Truth About Weight Loss. Hi, I'm Montel Williams. We're going to be exploring some of the most important issues facing our country today: chronic disease, obesity, and living a healthier life. And we're so fortunate to have a person that my friend Dr. Sanjay Gupta calls the wellness warrior, Naomi Whittel, taking us on a journey. Please welcome Naomi to the show. Naomi, how are you?
Montel.
Good to see you. Please, have a seat. You know, what a lot of people don't know about you is the fact that for the last 10 years that I've known you, you have been relentlessly searching the planet for answers about how we can all live healthier and happier lives. But you know, it's really kind of funny because we're going to talk about some of the answers today, but I don't think people really understand, you know, how to do that unless you think about this old saying. You know what? It was like, you don't know where you're going unless you know where you've been. Well, why don't you tell us all, how did we get here? How did Americans get to a point where we have such a bad diet and really such a bad lifestyle?
It's truly heartbreaking, Montel. And I think the way that we got here, it's not our fault. We were sold a bill of goods.
Okay, so what do you mean by that?
We've been told such a big fat lie. What our diets need to be like, what are the foods that we need to eat to be healthy.
And you know, what's been going on is that I guess for at least 60 years, we have followed along like, you know, little rodents just off that cliff, right?
Well, it's sort of seeped into our consciousness, this misinformation, this misguided information, and it has been the #1 contributor to chronic disease, the #1 contributor to pain and suffering.
But they also should know where this all started. Where did the misinformation begin?
It is so incredibly interesting, Montel. I had no idea until I started to go down this rabbit hole that it all started in the 50s. So when Eisenhower was in his administration, that's where it began. And you're going to hear from two remarkable women First, you're going to hear from Nina Teicholz. She is a journalist that has spent her entire career, over a decade, focusing on this exact story. And you're going to hear things that we can't even imagine. And then you're also going to hear from a doctor, Dr. Cate Shanahan, who's been the team nutritionist for the Lakers and so many different individuals. And she's going to really share with us some of the misguided information that we've really bought into all these years.
I want you to take a look at this.
We're at the Roosevelt Hotel, and we are in the actual room that Eisenhower stayed while he was president. And we wanted to do that on purpose because there's so much history around our health today and how it relates back to the story of Eisenhower. Can you share it with us?
So Eisenhower's heart attack really is like a pivotal moment in the history of medicine for a lot of reasons. And one of them is just the simple fact that cardiologists at that time could practice like decades, some even their entire careers, without ever running into a heart attack case. It was a new phenomena. The rates of heart attacks had dramatically increased in the past decade or so. This was part of a trend. And this was a beloved president, right? So in the midst of this terrifying moment in American history, the word heart attack became something that people heard for the first time and immediately were terrified.
So how did we get started? How did this whole idea, where was it born? The idea that fat is bad for health, that saturated fat and cholesterol are bad for health. It really began in the 1950s when the nation was in a panic over the rising tide of heart disease that had come from pretty much out of nowhere. In the early 1900s, heart disease was rare. And then it had risen to become the nation's #1 killer. So President Eisenhower himself has a heart attack in 1955, is out of the Oval Office for 10 days.
He was playing golf. They were just outside Denver, and he was on the 9th hole, and he started to have this discomfort that he thought was indigestion because he had just had a lunch of like Bermuda onions and some kind of giant greasy hamburger. And apparently he did that a lot and suffered heartburn frequently, so he just figured, it would go away, but it didn't go away. The job of figuring out what had happened fell to his personal physician. After doing his examination, he had, sure, possibly indigestion, but he was very concerned that this was actually a heart attack. And he was a bit out of his element. The stock market plummeted 6%, 14 billion in a day, the day that the news broke. Wow. Because at that point in time, there was a very poor understanding of what even a heart attack was. They called it a coronary. They made the decision ultimately to the teaching hospital in Denver. So the treatment involved strict bed rest. He wasn't allowed to have a member of his cabinet visit him. His heart attack occurred on the 24th of September, and he wasn't allowed to have any cabinet members come until October 11th.
After his heart attack, he got this advice from his doctor, Paul White, who told him, you have to, instead of butter, you have to eat margarine, you have to give up red meat, you have to eat dry crackers and bread. And he later had another heart attack, which killed him. So that did not spare him death from heart disease. He was also like a 4-pack-a-day smoker. So he was a really important figure in this story, because imagine the president being out of the Oval Office for 10 days.
Right.
So that's an incredibly long time. And this is a time when nobody knows what causes heart disease. People's fathers had not died of heart disease. It's like a killer, unknown source, all of a sudden killing men in their prime. Into this vacuum came a professor named Ansel Benjamin Keyes, who was a pathologist at the University of Minnesota. And his idea was that it was saturated fat and cholesterol. They would clog your arteries like hot grease down a cold stovepipe and give you a heart attack and die. And this was called the diet heart hypothesis.
What that heart attack did was enable a man with an agenda to create this mythology around fat. Ansel Keys was able to secure funding for a major study and had already been building a reputation for himself as somewhat of an expert in this area. Now, he came into this with the idea that the cause of heart attacks was related to dietary indulgences, particularly saturated fat.
Ansel Keys was this very unique individual. He had a very aggressive, domineering personality, and he was able to convince people of anything. People said to me, whom I interviewed, you have to understand about Ansel Keys, after he talked to you, he could convince anybody of anything, and he exhausted all your defenses. So he was able to get his diet heart hypothesis implanted into the American Heart Association. He got on the nutrition committee there, such that the American Heart Association in 1961 issued the first advice anywhere in the entire world saying, avoid saturated fat and cholesterol in order to prevent heart disease. That was like the tiny acorn that grew into the giant oak tree of advice that we now have all over the world.
So Paul Dudley White was contacted by Ansel Keys several years earlier when Ansel Keys, as a career strategist for himself, invited Paul Dudley White to a conference that he was putting on in Naples, Italy. So they already knew each other. Ansel Keys ultimately compelled him to his way of thinking, based probably on the fact that Ansel Keys was doing the most research on it of anybody in the world. And he was doing a particular kind of research, which I feel is kind of like a masculine thing. It was a numbers thing. It was statistics. And then, of course, the problem with statistics is what they say about statistics, which is that you can use them to make any point you want.
There was one study that Ansel Keys himself had done called the 7-country study. It's an epidemiological study. It means it only shows association and not causation, so that's a fundamental flaw. It cannot show causation. But it was really the only study that people had at the time. And there was no counter study to show anything else. So that was the study that prevailed. I mean, there's so many problems with the study, and what they seemed to find was that the people who ate diets higher in saturated fat were more likely to raise their cholesterol and die of a heart attack. But it turns out the study had all these flaws. One of the ones that is now most famous is that Ansel Keys clearly cherry-picked the countries that he visited, right? Because he had done sort of preliminary work in the field, and he knew that the country, if he went to Spain, Italy, Yugoslavia, where he did visit, he knew they didn't eat a lot of, especially if he went to the southern parts of those countries, he knew they didn't eat a lot of saturated fats, and they had long lives. But he didn't go to countries like Northern Italy or Switzerland or France or Germany, where they ate a lot of butter and more red meat, and they lived just as long. They had equal rates of heart disease post-World War II. Ansel Keys knew that, and he didn't go to these countries that would have contradicted his hypothesis.
This became one of the most famous studies in all of cardiology, has been cited tens of thousands of times by articles later. So anyway, this convinces Paul Dudley White. And Paul Dudley White was actually one of the founding members of the American Heart Association. Mm-hmm. And when the American Heart Association went from a small, underfunded professional organization to a much bigger powerhouse, it was Paul Dudley White's doing, because what he did was he was a great fundraiser, and he was able to broker a connection between Procter & Gamble that gave the American Heart Association something like $1.7 million endowment. This really set the stage for the American Heart Association to become the powerhouse that it is today. And in doing that, while depending on Procter & Gamble, who manufacture foods made out of not saturated fat, but out of vegetable oil, we see the beginning of a very dangerous connection between big food industry and medicine.
I think Ansel Keys really believed fat was bad for health. This was something that was almost a kind of religious belief for him. And I think that he fell in love with his own idea. And he was like the opposite of a scientist. You know, scientists are supposed to question and doubt their beliefs and try to prove themselves wrong and try every angle to see how they might be wrong, because what you're seeking is the truth, not the promotion of your own idea. But he was the opposite of that. He would disregard or actually bully and kind of try to squash anybody who challenged his ideas. He just had this overwhelming belief in himself and this particular idea.
And so how did it progress from there? So the Heart Association had gotten involved in this message, and he was promoting his ideas and concepts.
So you have to understand, this is a public health emergency, and there's no information, and everybody's in a panic. So into this vacuum comes the idea of that it's fat and cholesterol. So this is huge news. This is the first idea that anybody has really had. Ansel Keys is on the cover of Time magazine in the same year that the American Heart Association comes out with its advice. And the American Heart Association was really the only kind of health organization out there counseling people about how to avoid heart disease.
Time magazine put his face on the cover in 1961 as Time Magazine Man of the Year and gave him an extensive interview where they go into surprising detail. It's quite educational on the pathophysiology of heart disease, that it was unclear what exactly happened, but there was some kind of a connection between the buildup of fats, some kind of fats, we're not sure which ones, in the arteries, and then developing a blood clot, and that would lead to the heart attack. But in Ansel Keys' description, he's like, no, it's not the blood clot. It's just the fact that these saturated fats raise blood cholesterol, and then blood cholesterol slowly builds up in your artery, slowly choking off the flow of blood until one day, pop, and there's no more blood and you have a heart attack. So that image of an artery slowly building up fat and choking itself off, very much like fat might build up in a pipe under a sink, was familiar enough, and it made intuitive sense. That image, that idea, it's like a virus, actually, because it has reproduced itself and it has made people sick, and we can't shake it. We can't cure ourselves of this idea and replace it with another idea, with one that's more accurate, that actually reflects what really happens when people have a heart attack. I would say it's more like corrosion in a pipe. If we're going to stick with a pipe analogy, you pour caustic materials into your plumbing, the pipe corrodes and it leaks, and eventually it bursts. And that is what leads to the blood clot, because when there's flowing blood that contacts some of the material in the lining of artery, it triggers a clot. And so that's how you get a clot. So it's not purely the cholesterol, and it truly is not caused by saturated fat at all.
By sticking with this analogy of the pipe, what is getting poured down the pipe?
Vegetable oil.
And that's what's eroding it?
Yes. So vegetable oil has a caustic effect on our arteries because of the way that it interacts with the oxygen and the iron in our bloodstream. So unlike saturated fat, which is extremely stable and does not react at all with oxygen or iron, vegetable oils are high in polyunsaturated fats, which are extremely unstable and prone to oxidizing. So that is what arteriosclerosis is kind of this foamy lacquer of the fats in our other fats in our diet and vegetable oils, and it just creates this slick yellow grease lining inside our arteries, and this whole process of inflammation weakens the artery wall. And so that weakening and all that inflammation is what corrodes our pipes.
Ansel Keys turned out to be this very unique individual. He was charismatic, domineering, called a bully, even by his friends. And he was very persuasive. He was the one who had persuaded Paul Dudley White, Eisenhower's doctor, to avoid fat and cholesterol was the right diet, because he sort of targeted Dr. White and took him on a trip all over Europe where they became good friends. And people who knew him told me, whom I interviewed, said, when Ansel Keys had finished talking to you, you were just flattened. You just could not withstand the force of his arguments. So he managed to elbow his way onto the nutrition committee of the American Heart Association, and such that in 1961, the American Heart Association says, in order to avoid a heart attack, you need to avoid saturated fat and cholesterol. Less meat, less cheese, fewer eggs, more grains, a lot more grains, more cereals, fruit and vegetables, more vegetable oils.
Ansel Keys, who by the way, made a name for himself originally in the military. He created the K ration, which fed soldiers during World War II. Essentially, he invented processed food because that really was the first completely ready to eat meal.
Wow.
It was rip and eat. You didn't even have to heat it up. By the way, K in K-ration stands for keys. Something of an ego there.
Isn't that incredible to think that he created processed food? Ansel Keys created processed food.
Harvard still, lauds him as the father of the diet-heart hypothesis, but he should be known as the father of processed food, because with his theory that saturated fat was bad, he opened the door for processed food manufacturers to sell us whatever they wanted as long as it was low in saturated fat. Ansel Keys didn't just collect data on saturated fat. He also collected data on smoking. And the countries that he included, the countries that had the most heart disease on this graph, had the highest rates of smoking. And that was the true cause. And he saw it over and over again in all the other countries he studied because it was there in all the other countries he studied. But that's not what he published. That's not what he talked about. He talked about saturated fat. And in his interview with Time magazine, where Time magazine talks about the other factors being blood pressure and hypertension and smoking, in addition to fat intake, Ansel Keys says those don't play very much of a role. It's cholesterol. It's the saturated fat driving up your cholesterol. So he had the data. He saw the data. That study, the 7-country study, the data was in by 1958. He was interviewed in 1961. And he knew that he was telling a lie, knowing that it's going to be good for Procter & Gamble. What he's doing is he's allowing millions of people to actually die of heart attacks, because the real number one cause of heart attack death in Ansel Keys' time was cigarette smoking. It wasn't diet at all, because at that point in time, there wasn't that much vegetable oil. The die was cast for Americans to be lied to by the American Heart Association and by their doctors for the next half century ongoing.
As Ansel Keys' diet heart hypothesis grew and grew in popularity and was more and more adopted by really all the established authorities, especially the government, the National Institutes of Health. And as a scientist, it became more and more difficult to speak out. I mean, there was one particularly prominent lipidologist named Pete Ahrens, who at Rockefeller University, and he was sort of the most outspoken critic of Ansel Keys, and he was very, very prominent in his field. But increasingly, he would be disinvited from expert panels, had trouble getting his papers published, and he told his colleagues that his career suffered greatly for opposing Ansel Keys. There was another scientist from the University of Vanderbilt named George Mann, whom I did interview him when he was in a nursing home, but right before he died, and he said, he used to call Ansel Keys and all of his tight group around him, what we call the nutrition aristocrats, who kind of control all the expert panels and the medical journals. George Mann said, well, he used to call them the diet mafia because they ruined his career. I mean, he had been this extremely prominent biochemist. He had run studies for the National Institutes of Health, and he told me this story. He said one day when he was at the National Institutes of Health, a secretary called him out into the hall and said, if you continue your opposition to Ansel Keys, it's going to cost you your research grant.
Oh, wow.
And sure enough, he lost it. Scientists who spoke out were so clearly punished, right? If you stop getting your research grants from NIH, that takes away the lifeblood of being a scientist. And the next generation of scientists that came along, they saw what happened to the generation before them, and so they self-censored. That's what happened to pretty much in the 1980s, 90s, early 2000s. It really hasn't happened until, 2010 that people have started to really speak out again.
Wow. So all these years, we were almost muted?
Yes, basically. I mean, there was a vigorous debate about the diet heart hypothesis up until the mid-1980s. The mid-1980s, a very important study came out showing that it really looked like lowering your LDL was the way to avoid a heart attack, even though that was a study on drugs, not on diet. Nothing to do with diet. But they're like, well, if it works with a drug, it must work with diet too, even though that was never shown. But that's what happened in 1986. And the government adopted that position. So it's sort of like the hammer came down. And after 1986, there was no opposition. It just went quiet. It really didn't start up again until the early 2000s when Gary Taubes had an article on the cover of the New York Times Magazine saying, like, what if it's all been a big mistake? Maybe it's carbohydrates instead that are really the dietary villains. And so that idea disseminated out through the expert community, and people started researching this idea. The government knew, and major institutions knew, they needed better evidence. They knew that evidence wasn't good enough. So they actually undertook a series of really ambitious, randomized controlled clinical trials to see if they could prove Ansel Keys right. I mean, ultimately, over 65,000 people were tested on his hypothesis. Does saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease? And in none of those experiments could they show that to be true. None of the results supported his hypothesis. Wow. When people say, we don't know how to eat or what is a good diet, in reality, this huge body of evidence exists, but it's just been ignored.
When you blame cholesterol for heart attacks, you run into a problem. The average person's cholesterol level was originally somewhere around 260, and now it's actually 200. And the only way we've accomplished that is through pharmaceuticals. These drugs we call statins, which are also known as cholesterol drugs or cholesterol-lowering agents. So it's worked out great for processed food because they don't sell saturated fat. They don't want to. It's expensive to use butter and eggs and actual food. You have to refrigerate it. It's great for the pharmaceutical company because the only way to get somebody's cholesterol levels into this healthy zone is with drugs. Before we started this experiment, and it is truly an experiment because it had never been done in history. It couldn't have been done at any point in history because these oils didn't exist. So before we started this experiment, the rates of type 2 diabetes were almost non-existent. But the rates of obesity and our unhealthy diets have so dramatically accelerated that now children at age 2 are being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, and at age 3 and 4 are having complications of it like strokes and heart attacks. So this one idea that saturated fat was bad, that came from Ansel Keys, was like setting off an atom bomb in our health. And it has changed the course of history for human health.
So since the early 2000s, there's been a huge volume of studies now looking at this idea. Maybe it's not fat. Maybe it's carbohydrates. What is the effect of carbohydrates? So that has led to a large and fast-growing volume of literature now that really makes the case that Atkins was right, Gary Taubes was right, that it's really carbohydrates are what we need to reduce in order to be healthy.
See, absolutely crazy, because this means we've been following misinformation now for over 60 years.
Exactly, Montel.
Now, you know, when you're talking about diets and things, anecdotes are anecdotes. I mean, we've talked about a lot of anecdotal stories, people who have tried this and it worked for them. But when you have a doctor, a PhD, that has studied this for years, you got to stop and take a notice. And Angela Poff, right?
Correct.
Talk to me about her.
Dr. Angela Poff is a woman that has done tremendous research around the ketogenic diet. In fact, they're doing some of the leading research right at her institute. So I wanted everyone to be able to hear from her exactly where the cutting edge is in ketogenics.
Wow. Take a look at this.
Thank you for being here. Please tell us your name and your profession.
Sure. My name is Angela Poff. I am a research associate at the University of South Florida in Tampa. And I primarily focus on doing preclinical research on cancer metabolism, looking at how non-toxic therapies like the ketogenic diet or exogenous ketones or hyperbaric oxygen therapy might be a potential promising therapy for cancer.
That's fascinating. So when did you get interested in these sort of interventions?
So I had always wanted to be a scientist ever since I was a little girl. It was the only thing that ever really interested me, I think. And I loved the idea of being able to discover something new that just enthralled me when I was small. And so to do that, really in this field, you go into research, so scientific research, which typically involves a PhD in like a biomedical type field. So after undergraduate, I studied biochemistry and molecular biology in undergrad, and then started looking into graduate programs to do my PhD work. And I found University of South Florida in Tampa. I really liked the program, and I came down, and that was when I met Dr. Dominic D'Agostino.
Yes.
Who ended up joining his research lab, in part because he had this idea for this project that really just kind of blew my mind when I heard about it, which was testing this diet, the ketogenic diet, in a cancer model. And this was in 2010, so there wasn't a lot of this conversation going on at that time. And we found some really incredible results looking at the diet in conjunction with this other alternative non-toxic therapy, hyperbaric oxygen, in a mouse model of metastatic cancer. And then I really, I finished my PhD a few years ago, and then decided I just love the research that we're doing. I think it's really important, and the field is just exploding, and we love Tampa. We live, my husband and I both love it, and so I wanted to stick around and help kind of advance our lab's agenda and just continue that research. So since then, I've worked in the lab still as a postdoctoral scholar and then a research associate, just continuing to focus on ketone metabolism in health and disease.
Yes.
So not just cancer, but we also study like neurodegenerative diseases and seizure disorders as well.
So 8 years ago, almost 8 years ago, 2010.
About 8 years ago, yeah.
And what got you interested at that point? Like, why his work?
So I think personally, and I find this to be the case with a lot of people who are kind of in this field, they have some kind of personal tie.
Yes.
What makes it so interesting for them. So my father had brain tumors, first when he was very young, and then they had come back when he was in his 30s, when I was a little girl. And the treatment that he received when he was 8, it was this very aggressive radiation therapy, and it saved his life, and I will always be thankful that he had that option. But it caused cognitive and physical deficits to accumulate over the rest of his life. So he slowly had problems walking, problems with his cognition, and because of the toxicity of that radiation therapy. So while I'm very grateful that he had that option, I loved the idea of some non-toxic way to impact cancer. And I think it just really interested me from that personal perspective, and I thought this is really cool if it works. So
right.
I wanted to test it.
So that's why you got interested in it.
It's a big part of
really,
it.
in many ways, before your time,
I think
right?
so, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you started to do this research, and...
Yeah, it was fascinating from the very beginning. So we use preclinical models, so cell culture models and mouse models of a very aggressive cancer type. So it's a metastatic cancer model, which really mimics aggressive metastatic disease in humans, which of course, there's not a lot of good options for long-term management of late-stage cancer in humans. And so we started looking at the ketogenic diet, and we found some very impressive results off the bat. So just by changing their diet to this low carbohydrate, high fat, moderate protein diet, compared to the rodent chow, which is a high carb, low fat diet, the animals were living about 60% longer. And that being the only intervention.
So the only intervention was switching the carbs with the fats, essentially?
Yeah, basically.
So high carb, 60% carb versus high fat.
Yeah, maybe in the diets we use a couple different ones, but about an 80% diet, fat diet.
Fat diet.
As the ketogenic diet.
And how different was
well,
their life?
The tumors definitely grew much slower. We had less metastatic spread, slower. It took longer for the tumors to spread.
Yes.
And then the animals lived about 60% longer than the animals that were eating the high carbohydrate diet. And this was mimicking what other investigators had reported at the time. So there wasn't a ton of research yet at that time in animal models, but there had been several papers that had shown in various types of cancers that that diet could slow tumor growth and prolong survival. And it was really interesting to us because we were also interested in the specific role of ketones, which of course is something that our body makes when we're eating this diet, so energy molecule.
Can you help us understand that a little bit more?
So we can kind of think of, the major fuels that each of our cells can take in and then use to run all the processes in our bodies. And so most of us are very familiar with glucose. Yes. You get your blood glucose or your blood sugar tested, at the doctor's office and things like that. But there are alternative fuels that the body can use as well, and ketones are one of those. So this is, while glucose comes from carbohydrates and the diet, ketones are made from fats. So it's a breakdown of fat metabolism. The problem is most people, if you're eating a moderately high carbohydrate diet or you're eating excess calories, you don't ever really stimulate this process to make ketones. So most people have kind of what we call epigenetically silenced this production of ketones just by the environment, the diet that they eat. You're not typically making ketones. But our ancestors, when, especially our hunter-gatherer ancestors, probably went in and out of ketosis very regularly.
Oh, really?
So anytime you're going without food, you start making ketones. Yeah.
And so they would go back and forth.
Yeah, so basically in the fed state, you're probably running primarily on glucose if you're fed with a relatively or even modestly high carbohydrate type diet. But if you're going without food, you start breaking down your stored body fats, and then if you're eating a very high fat diet, like a ketogenic diet, then you would break down those fats that you're consuming and make ketones that way. So it's just an alternate fuel. And it was very important in our evolutionary history. It's actually thought that the ability for human brains to metabolize ketones was very important for us to evolve to have the size brains that we have. So it's a really interesting story of our evolution as well. But
I hadn't heard that before. Tell us a little more.
So basically, the human brain is much larger in percent body weight than most other animals, right? And the brain requires a lot of energy to run. So we're sitting here while the brain is taking up about 2% of our, or making up about 2% of our body weight. It's actually using about 20% of our energy. So it's extremely energetically demanding. And in the past, our ancestors didn't have the problem that we have where we have excess food all the time, right? They had the opposite problem. And they would go into periods where they didn't have readily available fuel for the brain as glucose. So basically, to simplify things, ketones are the only other primary fuel the brain can use for various reasons. And so in order to support the growth of such an important organ to the degree that it grew in humans, having the ability to break down our fats, our stored fats, when we aren't eating, so in between meals, right? It was extremely critical that our brain could use ketones, and that was one reason why our brains were able to evolve to the size that they have. That's the current kind of thought process.
Fascinating. And our brains, what is our brain's preferred fuel?
So it's an interesting question because you kind of hear this a lot. So even in like textbooks, it'll say sometimes even that glucose is the only fuel for the brain.
Right.
And that's not true. We've definitely known that since the 1960s. George Cahill at Harvard did many elegant studies clearly demonstrating that ketones can become a very important and even primary fuel for the brain in conditions where ketones are elevated. So glucose is pretty much always present. The brain's going to be utilizing glucose. But ketones, when they're present in the blood, the brain will utilize ketones to the degree that they're in the blood. So there is some data to suggest when ketones are present, you get a decrease in glucose uptake by the brain, which some people conclude means that ketones are preferred when they're available.
Right.
So it's probably just a mechanism to kind of conserve energy availability to the rest of the body and to the brain especially. There are certain tissues that require glucose that can't use ketones. But so some people say ketones are preferred, and I think there is data to support that statement. Yeah.
So you're married to a doctor.
Yeah.
And tell me a little bit about the ketogenic diet that you've done
this incredible amount of research on, and how the conversation at the dinner table will be with your husband, who, as a doctor,
sure,
refers to it.
He's extremely supportive and very interested in our work, and he's a big fan of it, so he likes to talk about it with his colleagues. It's interesting to me because, physicians are not typically classically trained in nutrition.
Right.
So my husband, for example, had about 3 hours of nutrition curriculum throughout the entirety of medical school.
Wow.
Yeah, which is kind of a problem.
Well, it's so hard for people like me or the people that are watching this today, because we rely on our physicians to give us our medicine, but also to give us nutritional advice.
Right.
And so with something like the ketogenic diet, we hear time and time again, check with your physician.
Right.
But it puts the physician in a very awkward position because they don't have that background.
I think so too. Yeah, absolutely. And I do think, especially because the ketogenic diet for individuals who especially have some kind of disease, it's really important to have their physician on board, because they understand how certain things might affect medicines or that specific condition. But I do think that it does put the physician in an awkward position because they've not studied the nutrition aspect of it extensively. And so that's why I think it's really important to have like an integrative team of like nutritionists and dietitians and physicians on board when you're talking about implementing a diet therapy. So people who do have the extensive training in this, and some physicians will go out and seek it out themselves, but it's not a typical part of the medical school curriculum. I do think it's improving, in part because of conversations like this.
Yes.
People are wanting to take their health back into their own hands, and I think diet is probably the #1 way that people can do that. And so from this kind of need that's coming from the people going to their doctors and saying, hey, I heard about this, what do you think? And they're saying, oh, I need to look into this further. And so we're starting to see more interest and more training type programs, which is fantastic. So I think it's been a very interesting evolution over the past few years, this conversation around the ketogenic diet. As I was mentioning to you earlier, when I started doing this research, it really felt like a very niche kind of area of interest where certain scientists or certain clinicians knew about it and were interested in it, but by and large it wasn't a household term. And now in late 2017, you feel like everyone is talking about the ketogenic diet, right?
You're the most popular girl in
there you go,
at the party, right?
We got in early, which is great, but also kind of opens itself for a lot of misinformation being out there too. But it's been fascinating because at that time, and just a few years ago, I think it was regarded more as this kind of fringe, maybe more snake oil or voodoo than anything.
What do you think about that from a scientific perspective, as a scientist?
Yeah, it is frustrating, especially when you hear those kind of comments from people who don't know the science behind it. The ketogenic diet has been used clinically for 100 years. It's a standard of care therapy for refractory epilepsy. So for seizures that don't respond to the anticonvulsant drugs. So it's not like it's some new unknown thing, right? And we have a lot of understanding of how it's working. Mechanistically, what it's doing to the cells in the body and why you might have these therapeutic effects. And so it's an area of hot investigation right now. But there's a lot of data actually behind this diet, especially for seizure control. That's where it's already an accepted, proven therapy, and now we're starting to kind of do those studies that are required to see if it's going to be an accepted therapy for things like cancer or other conditions as well, which is exciting.
Very exciting. Where do you see it in the next 4 or 5 years?
I think it's only increasing in popularity, in part because the data is so promising, which is really great. It is exciting to see these treatments and studies going into larger scale human trials, because at the end of the day, that's what we need for physicians to utilize this in their practice, for it to be highly recommended for certain conditions. We have to have those clinical trials. And in large part, especially in cancer, you know, those really haven't been done yet. But when I started, there was only a small amount of like anecdotal human data, whereas now there's probably 15 clinical trials.
Very nice.
So it's growing. So I'm really excited to see what the data shows from that.
And for you, when you talk to your mother or to your mother's girlfriends, what do you say about fat? Because there's such a negative association with fat in this country, especially, right?
There is. And fortunately, I think there's been kind of a turnaround, even at the highest levels, with understanding that this mentality of just fat in the diet is bad and always bad is really not true, and it's all very context dependent, right? And there's probably been some jump to the conclusions about effects from early studies back in the 70s and 80s that kind of got ingrained in our dietary advice that were never fully vetted or fully supported by the data. So I think even just within the past few years, there's been a rollback of that that fear of fat, and I think it's properly so, right? Which is exciting.
Yes.
I think there's still ways, like eating a high sugar, high fat diet is not good, right? So it's all context dependent, but people are starting to be more evidence-based, I think, and lessening this hysteria and fear of just fat in the diet.
Where do you see the research that you're doing in the lab, this really truly groundbreaking research that's impacting people everywhere? It's probably the most hot topic right now on people's minds. Where do you see it going?
So for me, what's most important is getting the clinical trials. We can't, I mean, as much as excitement as we can have from these animal models, you never really know what's going to happen until you do large trials in humans, and that's what we've been trying to go towards for a while. And we have recently formed some very good collaborations with really fantastic clinicians and put in for grants to initiate clinical trials based on the work that we've been doing. And as a scientist, that's like the most exciting thing you could do, to be able to take something from a cell culture dish to a human. So for me, that's what I'm looking forward to, being able to run these trials and really get the answers we're looking for, or hope to get the answers we're looking for.
When do you think they'll start?
If we're lucky, so I'll be optimistic, and we get the funding for the trials. That's what it comes down to, right? At the end of the day. We would hope to initiate a trial within the next year or two.
Wonderful.
Things move slowly in research, unfortunately.
Yeah. So in January, you're going to have your first little baby boy.
Yes.
What are you going to feed him?
So in our family, we like to kind of, I like to term it kind of just like smart carb, right?
Yeah.
So we don't do full keto typically, but my husband likes to do intermittent fasting, especially he's an emergency physician. So he has really long shifts where he just is working the whole time on his feet, and it's easier for him not to, go down to the cafeteria or something.
Yes.
So, I think it's important to focus your diet on whole foods, nutritional foods, low glycemic index type foods. I'm not scared of carbs in that context.
Right.
And then, he's not going to never have an ice cream cone from time to time. I think it's also important.
Maybe just the full fat one.
Yes, exactly, yeah. And it'll be a treat, not a staple of the diet. I think something that's sustainable and on a daily basis focuses on, nutritious foods is really the best.
That's great. Well, he's going to be a very lucky little boy.
Thank you. We're very excited.
Best of wishes.
Thank you.
What an incredible story. Really, what a wonderful lady.
And what I love so much is she really walks the walk. So she was pregnant while she was doing the interview, and now that she's had her child, guess what?
The whole family's on a ketogenic diet?
Exactly.
Oh, that's great.
There's an incredible study that Dr. Grudo is going to tell us about right now. She was the principal investigator on this huge study that was done on women, on the Women's Initiative study. And 47,000 of those women went on a low-fat diet.
And wait a minute, so that study was released, but I understand it wasn't widely released, so nobody really got the benefit of any information that they found out, and I really wonder why. Why did they hide the information from us?
You're going to see from Dr. Grudo, it's a very complex story, but an absolutely fascinating one.
All right, well, why don't we do this? Let's hear from Dr. Grudo. Take a look at this.
It is a huge pleasure to have you here. Thank you for making the time. And can you tell us a little bit about your background, your name, what brought you to where you are in your career at this point?
Okay, well, some of it was planned and some of it was an accident. My name is Jennifer Hays-Grudo. I'm a Regents Professor right now at Oklahoma State University, but I started out at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. I took a one-year half-time job as a research assistant, and I wrote a grant for $2 million that got funded.
Wow, congratulations.
So, thank you. And I thought, this is interesting and this is fun. It's kind of like gambling, writing grant proposals. So I stayed in the medical field, even though my background and training is in developmental psychology.
So tell me a little bit about this first grant that you got.
So the first grant actually had somebody else's name on it because the ink wasn't dry on my diploma yet. And it was called Cuidando el Corazón, Taking Care of Your Heart. And this is in the mid-1980s. And you might be too young to know the 1980s, but at that time it was all changing. Everything we thought we knew about diet was kind of turning upside down, and we went from the 4 food groups to the food pyramid, and fats were bad. And so if you wanted to live a long life and protect your heart, remember, cuidando el corazón, taking care of your heart, you would eat a low-fat diet. So I wrote, with some colleagues, the very first grant that did a culturally sensitive weight loss program using a low-fat method for Mexican Americans living in Texas.
So tell us about the study and what were the outcomes?
Well, the interesting about the study is that in any dietary study I've ever done, it really works for about 1/3 of the people really well. And about 1/3 it does no harm. And about 1/3 actually end up weighing more. Maybe they would have anyway. But in our group, we had 3 groups that we divided people into. We had the control group, which is typical. We had an information-only control group. Then we had an individual group, which we treated like most weight loss programs at the time. The mother comes in, she says, I want to lose 20 pounds. We said, come to these classes. We taught her how to cook, we taught her how to exercise, and she did the program in this group. The innovation that we did was to say, you know, in Spanish-speaking homes and in Mexican-American families, families are important. So we brought the husbands and the wives in together, and then we had a program for the children, and we indoctrinated the whole family in low-fat eating. They did fine. In fact, the family group lost a significant amount of weight. They kept it off for 2 years. They didn't keep it off after that, and then the grant is over. And I don't know what happened to them since then. I've often wondered, because now we realize that it's more than not eating fat. Now we know it's more than just counting calories or exercising, that the quality of the food you eat is important, but it's taken us a long time to find that out.
So this was in the 80s?
This was 1986 to 1991.
Do you know at that time what the level of obesity or overweight was as a percentage of the population here in the U.S.?
The CDC has great slides of the United States, and every year we get more and more orange and red, and the percentage has gone up and up and up.
So we would imagine that if this study in 1986, 2 years later, 1988, and we sort of put it against those slides, it would be interesting to see where it was in 1990.
And then 1995, and then 2000, and then 2005. And there really hasn't been a drop-off that's significant in any place that hasn't made major changes to the culture, to the food environment, to the activity level of a community. So one of the things a friend of mine was able to discover with some other colleagues was that children exercise more when they have playgrounds. Now, you might not think we would need to do a several $1 million grant to determine that, but apparently we did, because we don't often make common sense connections between the environment and the people's health who live in those environments. We tend to want to look at what individuals are doing, when in fact it's what does the environment offer in the way of opportunities to do, whether it's children or adults, whether it's food or activity. So I don't know what happened to that group of Mexican-American Texans. I like to think that because they were in this study that they became more aware of the importance of what they were eating. We do know that some of them went back to college because as they learned that they could control something simple like their weight, they could have control over the other aspects of their lives, because it all goes together. But at that time, we were still pretty focused on weight and fat, and how dietary fat was the source of everything. In fact, as that study was about to end, that study became part of a larger center, National Research and Demonstration Center, and those centers were set up by the National Institutes of Health to foster interdisciplinary research, so that the guys downstairs working in the labs on atherosclerosis and lipoproteins could feed us information that we would take out to the community. At least
Very
that
interesting.
was the idea in theory. And the people who were behind this, in fact, the first originator of this concept was the cardiovascular surgeon, Michael DeBakey, who was at one time the president of Baylor College of Medicine, where I was working. He stepped down as president, or chancellor, I think, at that point, but he was still a surgeon. He was still very actively involved. And as we were wrapping up this grant cycle, it turned out you couldn't ask for a renewal because the NIH was no longer funding these. They said, we have enough interdisciplinary research now. We launched it, it's good. And we thought, now what do we do? Because we were supporting all these people on this center. So we decided to create the DeBakey Heart Center, which would continue that kind of work. And, you know, I was nothing. I was 35 maybe. But I'm part of this program, so I get to sit in on all the planning sessions to create the DeBakey Heart Center with, you know, we used to call him God at Baylor, Michael DeBakey himself, and my boss, the chairman of the Department of Medicine, Tony Gatto, who's now president of Cornell Medical School. And I think he was president of the American Heart Association at the time. This is the early 90s. And we were at a DeBakey Heart Center lunch planning committee meeting. And DeBakey himself hardly ever ate lunch. But if he did, he would have a little wedge of a really fatty cheese like brie or camembert. And I think that's what triggered this kind of argument that I watched kind of with my mouth open, watching Tony Gatto, my boss, head of the American Heart Association, adamant that it's all about dietary fat and cholesterol, and Tony and Michael DeBakey eating his cheese at lunch, saying, it's not about cheese, Tony. It's not about fat. It's not about cholesterol. And he said the average cholesterol value of a patient lying on the operating table in my operating room is 188. That's his cholesterol. So it can't be about cholesterol.
Oh, wow. I just got shivers.
He thought even then it was about inflammation.
And this was in
Early 90s.
early 90s.
But DeBakey was a genius.
Yeah.
He was one of the first to ever explore how the heart really worked and to do a coronary artery bypass with a graft that apparently he did the first one in Dacron on his wife's sewing machine. He led to the artificial heart. He designed the first pump that allowed open heart surgery to happen. But his mind was always working, and he said, it can't be about cholesterol. So yeah, I'm going to eat my camembert. That's all I've had all day.
Wow.
Kind of an early paleo diet.
Right.
So even then, we had some clues that it wasn't about fat. It wasn't about dietary fat. It wasn't about dietary cholesterol. But we didn't have enough clues. And the dominant paradigm of the time was like this juggernaut that just kept rolling. So the next project I was on was the Women's Health Initiative. Now, the Women's Health Initiative had many components, and most people know about the hormone trials because we studied with a randomized clinical trial, randomly assigned women with and without a uterus to either get progesterone plus estrogen if they had a uterus, or estrogen only if they'd had a hysterectomy.
And how large?
Well, we had 27,000 total in the hormone trial,
Wow.
but we had 87,000 in the dietary fat study. And you don't hear a lot about that.
Is that the largest study?
The largest study I know of, at least in this country, looking at what happens when you change the diet of a whole group of women across the country. 40 clinical centers around the country in all parts of the United States, all ethnicities and races. And we monitored them. We put them on this intervention to lower the fat in their diet.
And for what reason? Why were you looking to lower the fat?
Well, we had this hypothesis because Japanese women in Japan don't get breast cancer. Japanese women who move to the States after a few years or a generation have breast cancer at the same rates that American women do. So we thought it's not their genes, it's their diet. And if you look at the Japanese diet and you look at the American diet, one of the big differences is fat in the diet. Japanese women tend to have a lower fat diet. So we kind of took this simplistic notion and we said, let's put all these women on a low fat diet. Now, we did not put them on a Japanese diet. They were not eating fish and seaweed and miso soup. They were eating the American version.
And we know how much great oil is in seafood and all of those
We weren't
sources.
looking at the kind of fat because that notion really hadn't percolated to the surface when this study was designed. We just looked at simple carbohydrate, protein, and fat. And we aimed to get the fat from the average American diet at that point was about 37% down to 20% if we could.
Wow. So mostly carbohydrates. So when you reduce the fat, you increase the carbohydrates and the protein, or just primarily the carbs?
Primarily the carbs.
Okay.
I remember we had contests every month across the country to come up with the tastiest low-fat recipe. And I can't tell you how many times the WHI trifle won. And this trifle was made with non-fat angel food cake, non-fat pudding mix made with non-fat milk, made with some fruit and some non-fat Cool Whip. And I remember thinking to myself, this is low fat, but this is not very Japanese-like. And sure enough, we did not find an effect of this diet on breast cancer rates in our study.
You studied 87,000 women, and I'm sure with this study you were assuming based on the size of that study that it would be a clear finding.
In fact, when you have even very, very small differences with that number of subjects, the way all of our statistical models work, everything is significant.
Right.
But it wasn't.
Because what do you mean it wasn't?
I mean, that group did not have breast cancer rates that was lower than the group that ate. No change. It was hard for a lot of people to believe it. For years afterwards, people kept reanalyzing the data. I wasn't part of that group because I had gone on and moved on to other things by then. In fact, I went and looked back at childhood obesity, and I realized that during the 8 or 10 years I was doing work on the menopausal women in the Women's Health Initiative, the rate of childhood obesity had doubled or even tripled in that 10-year period.
Wow.
And I came across a statistic recently that said about 20% of Americans regularly have a meal in their car. They're not pulled over by the lake or under a tree having a sandwich. They're on the freeway eating. So it's more than just fat or the kind of fat, it's also the atmosphere. It's the quality of the ingredients. It's how close to home they're grown and how much trauma exists before they come to your table.
Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I can't wait to hear more of the findings and how it can impact our lives.
As we learn how all of these things are connected, now we know that the gut is telling our brain what to do. We used to think the brain was the supreme commander of the whole body, and now we're learning, oh, the gut has a role in this too, and we know that it's all connected. We, for so many years, tried to pretend the body was like a machine, and we could take all these little parts, whether it's dietary cholesterol or a germ, you know, that A causes B causes C. But we forgot about all those other letters in that soup bowl. They're all connected. And now we are starting to have the opportunity, the statistical tools, the imaging tools, if we're talking about the brain, the molecular identity tools, to really piece together these complex interactions. So I think we're learning more all the time.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It was wonderful to spend time with you, and we will keep learning and growing from the research that you're doing.
That's my goal.
So interesting. And what's also interesting is that, I guess, Jennifer started her career with a guy by the name of Dr. DeBakey, who was considered one of the world's premier heart surgeons, right?
That's right. As one of the world's premier heart surgeons, he ate so much fatty cheese, from Camembert to the Brie. That was what he ate more than anything else.
And that's absolutely counterintuitive to what almost every heart surgeon in this country would say.
Exactly right.
Crazy. Well, coming up next is Dr. Joseph Maroon, who I should let everybody know you and I have both been friends with for quite a long time, right?
Dr. Joe Maroon is just an incredible human being. I've seen him help so many people. He's also the Steelers' team neurosurgeon.
And what does he kind of think about a diet like this?
I love the way he talks about and educates us on how food has such a dramatic impact on our health and well-being, and specifically for people that are dealing with neurodegenerative disorders and diseases, other ailments. Now, you have a son who's in a contact sport.
Absolutely.
And for all of those families that have a child in a contact sport, you want to really watch this, because he's going to share some information that is absolutely fascinating.
Take a look at this.
Dr. Joseph Maroon, thank you so much for being with us today. Can you tell me a little bit about your background?
Surely. First, it's a great pleasure to be here with you, Naomi, as always. But I'm a neurosurgeon at the University of Pittsburgh. I've been there forever, it seems. I'm also a professor of neurosurgery, Heindel Scholar in neuroscience. I have the honor of being the team neurosurgeon for the Pittsburgh Steelers for the last 20 plus years.
Incredible.
And also the medical director for World Wrestling Entertainment, WWE, that everybody watches every Friday and Monday night on Raw and SmackDown.
And you're an Ironman.
I've been competing in triathlons for about 25, 30 years and have done 8 Ironman distance triathlons, 5 in Kona, the last 3 years ago.
It's remarkable to think about you and the amount of work that you've done with the brain, with the human brain. And I would love to just know a little bit about why did you become a neurosurgeon, and why is the brain so important to you?
Well, in medical school, I really was interested in psychiatry initially, but I ended up rotating on the neurosurgical service and just loved the idea of actually helping people with traumatic brain injury, with various types of neoplasms and developmental disorders. And the surgical correction of these, which was fascinating to me, where you can make such a difference in people's lives by operating in a safe way on the brain and also the spine, the back, spinal discs, and fracture dislocations and things of this nature. So I became very intrigued with the technical aspects as well as the intellectual aspects of studying the greatest and most complex organ in the universe.
It's remarkable. And for everybody that's watching, I just would love for people to know I've known you for over 8 years, And the reason I'm sharing this information is truly because of you and the understanding that you have of the brain, of people's health, and the tremendous impact you've had on the world. So this entire process is really in honor of the work that you do, and I want to make sure that everybody that's listening learns about why are, and let me ask you this, why are we suffering so much with the health of our brains, and what can we do to really improve that?
Well, quite a few years ago, Naomi, I realized that the words of Hippocrates, 2,500 years ago, the father of medicine on the island of Kos, inscribed in a granite stone, is an admonition to physicians. He said the first responsibility of a physician is to prevent disease. If that be impossible, to cure it. If that too be impossible, to relieve pain. And maybe 20, 15 years ago, I realized that virtually 95% of my work, my activity, was trying to cure problems, and if that were impossible, to relieve pain in patients, but we were doing virtually nothing to prevent disease. And as a triathlete, as an athlete, as someone very well aware of the mind-body connection, I invested a lot of time in learning about preventive measures and what's the cause of so many of the diseases of aging that we're discussing here today. And we're talking about the diseases of aging. We're talking about Alzheimer's disease that affects 1 in 9 patients over age 65, 1 in 3 over 85.
Wow.
We're talking about cancer, about the metabolic aspects of cancer. Is it all genetic? Is it a combination of metabolic and genetic? We're talking about diabetes that affects 15 to 20% of the population of the United States. And we're talking about the obesity epidemic that is now affecting 2/3 of the people in the United States who are either overweight or obese.
Right.
Obesity is now the greatest source of inflammation in our body, and inflammation is the common factor of cancer, heart disease, stroke, Alzheimer's disease, and diabetes and others. So the question is, how did we get to the point where 2/3 of our society is overweight or obese? You know, what happened? And I began reading, and I met people like Tom Seyfried, who's brilliant, and other individuals who have done work in bioenergetics, about fasting, about diet. And it really came down to learning about carbohydrates and fats, and the so-called ketogenic diet, and how ketones are fuel for the brain actually more efficient than carbohydrates and glucose. You know, 20% of the blood flow that our heart pumps goes to our brain. 20%. Wow. It utilizes 20 to 25% of all the glucose and sugar that we take in because the brain preferentially uses carbohydrate. But is that a requirement? And I discovered that that's not.
It's not a requirement. The brain does not need the glucose. So what happens when we eat the pastas, all the simple carbs, the sugar? What happens to the brain?
What happens is the body really needs insulin to get the carbohydrates into the cells. The more you eat, particularly high fructose syrups and all the garbage that we feed ourselves these days, it increases our insulin level. With elevated insulin levels, it also leads to the conversion of the carbohydrates into fat. Fat gets deposited in our various parts of our bodies. Fats are full of inflammatory agents called cytokines and chemokines that result in inflammation in our bodies. If you get a splinter under your finger, what happens?
Right.
It gets red, hot, tender, and swollen. Well, what happens when we eat the plethora of carbohydrates that we do is these agents get released throughout our bodies into our blood vessels, for instance. So you have silent inflammation that affects the endothelial lining, the inner structure of the blood vessels to your heart, to your brain, so you get strokes, you get heart attacks. And very high levels of insulin are associated with Alzheimer's disease as well. In fact, Alzheimer's has been referred to as type 3 diabetes.
Right.
Because again, too much of the glucose and the carbohydrates, the brain cells become resistant, require more insulin, and then eventually go into a death spiral, if you would, and die.
When you look at a brain on high levels of glucose, or you operate on so many different people, and we think about 2/3 of our population being overweight or obese, do you see that reflected? Do you see obese or overweight brains? What does that look like?
That's a good layman's question.
Yes.
I have to say that. If we, say for a tumor or epilepsy or whatever we do surgery for, if we have to do a craniotomy, remove a section of the skull and open the dura that covers the brain. And you look at the pulsating brain, you can't see anything grossly. The Alzheimer's is, unless it's shrunken.
Right.
You can see the shrunken aspect, but the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease is made on a microscopic basis. There's the deposition of what's called beta amyloid plaque, sticky stuff that becomes neurotoxic to the surrounding environment, and neurofibrillary tangles, which are dead axons that clump up and then form, again, an inflammatory response.
Right.
And it's the inflammation of the brain, neuroinflammation, that leads to the progressive degeneration. So visually, grossly, you can only see some atrophy.
Sure.
But you don't see any other hallmarks.
But you as a neurosurgeon, when you're looking at it microscopically, you're able to obviously see the distinctions.
Yes, you see the neurofibrillary tangles and the beta amyloid plaque.
Wow.
The interesting thing that, when we talk about ketone bodies, what are ketone bodies and what is a ketogenic diet? I think it's important to go into that just a bit. And quite frankly, when you think in terms of evolutionary biology, we've been on a ketogenic diet for about 3 million years.
For 3 million years. And when we think about that, and people now every day on the street we're talking about ketogenics as if it's something new. So you're saying 3 million years.
Yeah, and from our ancestors in the African subcontinent on the savannah, we were in a feast or famine mode all the time. When we had the opportunity to gourmandize or feast, what would happen when we had excess calories that we would ingest? We would deposit these calories in the form of triglycerides. Our livers would make fat, adiposity. And what was the benefit of adiposity? Well, when the famine came, our bodies would then utilize the deposited fat. And how does it utilize? And this is the key point that I think needs to be understood. The signals that occur when we're hungry, there are a couple of compounds, ghrelin, which tells us we're hungry, and leptin, which tells us when we're satiated.
And these are hormones.
They're hormones. So when we're hungry, there's a biochemical cascade in our liver that converts the fat to ketone bodies. And ketone bodies are another source of fuel. And the ketone bodies are actually a more efficient source of fuel than carbohydrates. You actually generate more energy, and they're cleaner burning, meaning when our mitochondria, which are the organelles in each cell that usually takes carbohydrates and oxygen and makes energy, ATP.
Yes.
Well, when that occurs, there are agents called free radicals that are released in the mitochondria, and these free radicals are agents that can literally damage the nucleus of the cell. It can damage the mitochondria when they're in excess. And with ketones also are a source of fuel. In fact, we've been made evolutionarily, when we are unable to get glucose, we break down the fat, we make ketone bodies. Ketone bodies enter into what's called the Krebs cycle, which also makes ATP, or energy, but it's cleaner burning. It actually makes more energy, ATP, than carbohydrate. And it also is cleaner burning so that you don't have as much free radicals, which are disruptive to the proteins within the cell. I don't know if that's clear enough.
It is. So if I take that and I sort of share an analogy, if we're thinking about the gasoline industry and I take my car to choose which kind of gas I want, is this in the same way if our body is like our vehicle and we get to choose the type of gas we put in?
I think that's a close analogy, but in the oil industry, you have no idea what you're putting in your tank anyway.
Right.
How much is gasohol and how much. So I'll take that. I like the analogy, but it is true. Instead of substituting gas, let's substitute fuel.
Perfect.
For gasoline.
Yes.
So it's the fuel that we put into our body that determines how the engine is going to run.
And so as an athlete, as the Steelers team doctor for all these years, as a neurosurgeon, when you look at the different types of fuels that we can put into our body, what do you use?
Yeah, I use basically a high-fat, low-carbohydrate, 0.5 gram to 1 gram of protein per lean body mass. I try to hit that target every day.
And how much do you exercise on average on a daily basis?
I do at least an hour a day.
Right.
I'll swim, bike, run, lift, stretch.
And when you're preparing
I get an hour a day. When I'm preparing for a triathlon, particularly an Ironman distance race, it's a minimum of 2 hours a day.
Wow.
And then on weekends, each weekend I'll increase the time and the distance and the endurance, beginning about 6 to 8 months in advance.
Incredible. So as that level of performance you're putting your body through, obviously you spoke a little bit about the free radicals, and I know that exercise can produce more free radicals. How does the fuel work with the free radicals and the extra pressure you're putting on your body?
And that's a very good question. There's with the ketogenic diet, there's much less inflammation that's created as a result of burning a cleaner fuel. The exhaust is cleaner, you might say, but so what happens, you get more energy, and clearly it increases focus, it increases concentration.
Interesting.
And I see this in myself in surgery. When I'm hungry, when I'm primed like this, my senses, and everybody's senses, not just mine, everybody's senses become much more acute. And again, go back to the savannah. When you're hungry and you're searching for food, you see better, you smell better, you hear. Evolutionarily, as a hunter and a gatherer, you're much more attuned to your environment. So the focus, the concentration, the intensity are all much heightened. And with the ketogenic diet, the ketone bodies actually provide better fuel for the brain, and the brain, I think, functions at a higher level without the carbohydrates. And you know, I think we should get back to what's happened after 3 million years.
Yes.
And as I said, for 3 million years we've been on a ketogenic diet. What's happened in the last 60 years that has resulted in 2/3 of the United States population being overweight, overcommitted, obese, and our kids. In kids, it's horrible. Babies, infants. What are infants given when they're very early sucking? They're giving various juices that are really not juices. It's virtually pure sugar. Sugar has become an addiction. It is an addiction.
For sure.
And some people have suggested it's actually more potent than cocaine in terms of our desire, our need for sugar. So what's happened in the food industry that's resulted in this. And I think we have to go back to an investigator from the University of Minnesota in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, 70s, by the name of Ansel Keys. Ansel Keys was a very well-meaning nutritionist from the University of Minnesota who was curious about the question, why is there such an increase in cardiovascular disease in certain populations, heart attacks?
Around the world?
Around the world.
Okay.
Around the world. So he had a preconceived idea that it probably was related, he thought, to eating too much fat. So he selected several countries that had a high-fat diet and had a high cardiovascular disease, and didn't select a few others that might have balanced it.
So which sort of countries did he?
So he looked at various European countries and the United States and concluded that there was an association between a high-fat diet and cardiovascular disease. He also, in Italy, in Naples, Italy, he saw that they had a Mediterranean diet. So he postulated that the Mediterranean diet may be better than a saturated fat diet. So when President Eisenhower had his heart attack, he was friendly with a cardiologist who took care of him, and also was able to get this particular doctor to buy into his postulate that a high-fat diet causes cardiovascular disease. He also convinced the American Heart Association that a high-fat diet is associated with cardiovascular disease. And the important word is associated, not causative. There was an association, he found, between those countries and those people who had a high-fat diet and heart attacks and cardiovascular disease. And based on that observation, which was clearly, and still it is very disputable now, the food industry, the government, began emphasizing a high carbohydrate, very low fat diet. So diet foods became available.
Low fat, no fat.
Low fat, no fat, marketed incredibly well. But what happened is the things that were low fat, they started to add glucose and sugar to it. Yogurt. Today, you go into your store, you pick up some of the yogurt.
Unbelievable.
It can have up to 6 teaspoons of sugar in a little thing like that of yogurt.
And we think we're doing something good for
Yeah,
ourselves.
we think we're doing good. And it tastes delicious. We love it. I mean, it feeds our addiction.
Yeah.
So from the 70s on, the low-fat, high-carbohydrate craze took over, and the food industry made billions of dollars on marketing this. So you go to a Giant Eagle or you go to one of the large food chains, and you see what people have in their baskets as they're going through the checkout line. It's all very high carbohydrate food. So when you're eating all of these excessive carbohydrates, what happens? Well, the sugar gets absorbed, and it increases your insulin level first to drive more sugar into your cells. So you become insulin resistant, and with the insulin resistance, you deposit more fat with the carbohydrates that aren't burned, going back millions of years to deposit fat, which becomes inflammatory. And then you become hungry all the time because you're never satisfying. The leptin gets out of whack as well, our satiety approach, so that we feel hungry even though we're eating a lot, and it's more carbs, more carbs. So we have 2/3 of our population obese or overweight.
And it makes so much sense when you speak about addiction and the process that we go through biologically and psychologically in our cravings for more and more and more sugar over time. And it becomes that incredibly negative, vicious cycle that we as a society, like you mentioned, over 2/3 of us are living in that. And I believe it's even more I know for myself, my addictions to sugar and how easy it is to start going down that path once you begin.
It's easy, and also it's extremely difficult to break that habit.
Yes.
And a lot of it is cognitive awareness, what
Yes.
we're talking about. So many people I talk to, I'm tired, I'm fatigued, I don't have energy, I'm irritable, I'm depressed.
Yeah.
All of these complaints are related in major part to diet. And to break that cycle takes 2 to 4 weeks. I mean, there's a withdrawal that occurs, just
Certainly.
like in cigarette smoking,
Yes.
or other addictive substances. But once you feel better, you think better, you work better, you exercise stronger, life becomes much more worth living.
Yes. Tell me a little bit about, we've spoken about a lot of the degenerative diseases, and yesterday I had the opportunity to interview Mary Newport.
Yes.
And she spoke about how MCT oil, with one dose of it that she gave to her husband, it was therapeutic and it had a huge impact on his health and his life, and it sounded like a miracle. I just wanted to understand a little bit about how a fat that you can ingest could have that kind of impact on the brain.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have to point out that's what we call an anecdotal case.
Got it.
You know, it's one case, and but does it make sense physiologically, biochemically? As we mentioned, with Alzheimer's disease, which is what her
Yes.
husband was diagnosed with, the cells, you have a high insulin level so that the cells are not getting the energy that they require for the mitochondria to make ATP.
Yes.
And they literally shrink up and die. So it makes sense that with medium chain triglycerides, these have several advantages. Number one, it goes directly through the intestinal gut lining to the liver, bypassing the bile and the gallbladder. And they go directly to the liver, where the liver makes ketone bodies out of medium chain triglycerides. And the source of MCTs are primarily coconut oil and products of that nature. And the ketone bodies then immediately enter the bloodstream. And because they're water soluble, they can pass the blood-brain barrier. So they can immediately enter into the brain and into the substance of the brain. So you're providing a source of energy for dying brain cells that, you know, like being on a desert with no water.
Yeah.
And now you're supplying some water, some nutrition for these cells. So it makes sense that clearly on the short term, that things like medium chain triglycerides, a ketogenic diet will be helpful for patients with neurodegenerative disease. And in fact, if you Google neurodegenerative disease, ketone bodies, you can spend a whole afternoon reading the papers now, looking at various ways to enhance your ketone bodies to slow, prevent, obviate neurodegenerative diseases.
Let's talk about a couple of them. So let's talk about Parkinson's, or let's talk about MS, and how so many people are influenced by these, and how a ketogenic diet or good fat can influence.
Yeah. Well, when you think of neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, they're all diseases, the cause of which we are not 100% sure by any means, and the cure of which we don't have any at this time. However, going back to the basic principles of bioenergetics, which is what we're really talking about, supplying fuel, it just makes sense that the cleaner fuel, the more ketones, can have an ameliorating effect on these diseases. And this is being intensely studied now throughout the world, actually, by various research units.
And then separately, what about MS?
MS, You know, again, that's a huge subject in terms of various areas of the world that individuals develop MS. Oftentimes it's in those with the least sunlight. So MS patients frequently are very deficient in vitamin D. There's a relationship possibly between sunlight and MS. Again, it's an inflammatory disease that causes the myelin, which is the insulation around nerve fibers, to die, shrink up, and cause plaques, so-called MS plaques, which are like beta amyloid plaques, but they're different constituents that, again, lead to further degeneration. So it's like a small brush fire in a dry forest. So once these things get started, it's a cascading effect that occurs. So we wrote a paper, Dr. Blaylock, a neurosurgical colleague, and I, a few years back, entitled Immunoexcitotoxicity. MS is an immunological problem in which the body fights against itself or destroys itself. There's an excitotoxic, meaning there are chemicals, one of which is called glutamate, which is released particularly in head trauma as well, that is toxic to the surrounding cells. So the question, and you're bringing up good points, this immunoexcitotoxicity is a common factor in multiple neurodegenerative diseases. And what's the best way to attack it? I think we're talking about epigenetic factors.
Yes. So for all of the people that know about epigenetics and for those that don't, just can you give us a quick overview of what epigenetic factors are?
In the last 15 or 20 years, it's a whole new science of medicine. And when you think of our cells, each cell has chromosomes, and on the chromosomes are our genes. 26,000, 23,000 genes. The genes are like a blueprint. They sit on the table of a construction company and don't do anything until they're acted upon. So what acts upon genes to tell them what they do? You know, our genes make about 100,000 different proteins in the cells. So what acts upon them are factors above the genes. And it's very simple. It's diet, it's physical activity, it's various environmental factors like smoking, drinking, toxins in our air, our water, our environment, and controlling stress. Stress is an incredibly important epigenetic factor. With prolonged chronic stress, various chemicals, in particular cortisol, gets elevated in our body, which literally destroys brain cells. You look at MRIs on patients under chronic stress, their hippocampus, which is the center for memory, is shrunken. If you put them in a therapeutic program, diet, exercise, control the stress, literally, the hippocampus can be seen to enlarge and get bigger. We used to think that once the brain cells die, that's it. That's not so. We now know we can make new brain cells. And the most effective way to do that is with exercise, physical activity, and also dietary control and obviating toxic stress.
Remarkable. When you speak about the stress that is acute or even prolonged and the impact that that has on our bodies, when we are balancing our insulin levels and we're not on that drug-induced glucose run that we go on so much, what does that do to our stress? So if we're eating a high-fat diet and our insulin is much more balanced, what does that do to our stress levels?
Excellent question. I think when we're eating a high-carb diet, you know, again, it's the inflammatory process that occurs that results in feeling sluggish, depressed, tired, weary, irritable, and impulsive, anger control issues. All these things are related to the epigenetic factor of diet. Eating the appropriate diet, particularly a high-fat, very low-carb diet, can mitigate many of these things. And we feel better, we think better, we perform better, we exercise better. So it's the yin and the yang, and it's what we choose. And the thing about epigenetic factors, it's choice.
Yes.
Every one of these, diet, exercise, what we eat, smoke, drink, and stress control, we have choices here. It's not, our genes are not our destiny. And that's a key point.
Yes.
My father died at age 60 of a heart attack. I thought at 60, anything beyond that's a bonus year. I'm now a septuagenarian. I don't like to say 70, but I'm a septuagenarian. And every year, you know, I've really, now I'm functioning at least as high as a level, and I think maybe even higher than I did 20 years ago.
Remarkable.
And
you're talking about intellectually, physically?
In all areas.
Yeah.
You know, I kind of knock on wood when I say that,
yeah.
because I know the bullets are coming by, and you never know when.
That's right.
What's going to hit. You know, I see this every day in my patients: cancer, heart disease, stroke, get hit by a PAT bus. You never know.
Right.
But I do know that what I'm doing now optimizes my performance in all spheres. And it has been a choice. And I have to get a plug in for that great book that I wrote entitled
Yes.
Square One.
That's what I was just going to ask you about. So tell us about the book and why you wrote it.
Well, it's entitled Square One, A Simple Guide to a Balanced Life. And Sanjay Gupta
Yes.
wrote a very nice complimentary statement about it, as well as others. But basically, everything we're talking about is about balance.
Yeah.
Everything in life is about a teeterboard. Not too much, not too little. The Romans had a saying, mens sana in corpore sano, a healthy body and a healthy mind. Aristotle said, hit the mean between extremes. Not too much, not too little. So it's about balance. And at one point in my life, I was way out of balance. I had major issues with my family. My father died suddenly. My job, I had to quit neurosurgery for a full year. I was chief of neurosurgery at a university hospital one day doing brain surgery. My father died and other things of a nasty nature occurred. I couldn't handle the stress. I was literally overwhelmed by stress, pathologically depressed. And my father did not do my mother a favor and bequeathed to her an incredibly dilapidated truck stop in Wheeling, West Virginia, with a very high mortgage. And all of this happened at the same time, so I literally, my wife left, my kids were gone. I moved into a farmhouse in Wheeling, West Virginia with my mother and worked in a truck stop. I was filling up 18-wheelers and flipping hamburgers for a year. And thinking, you know, how did this happen? And it happened because, number one, I had no insight into what I was doing with my life. It was all work. I neglected the family. There was no spirituality, which is critically important.
Yes.
And there was no physical. I was 20 pounds overweight, and then the banker who held the mortgage on the truck stop called me one day and said, "Hey, Joe, would you like to go for a run?" I think he wanted to see if I'd be around long enough to pay off the mortgage. So I said never. But I went down and I ran around the track 4 times. It took me an hour, I think, and I said never again. But that night was the first night I slept in 4 months. Ooh. So a little light bulb went off, and I went down the next day, and I went 1.25 miles, then 1.5 miles, then 2 miles. And pretty soon, my depression started to lift. My diet improved. I needed better fuel, and I evolved to this naturally, not because I made a decision, I'm going to do this, but I found myself fewer carbs, better fats, better supplements. And after several months, I was able to get back to the university, and really the most productive part of my life. But it was adversity that forced me to either survive or get better.
Yeah.
And the point, I guess the message is that no matter what the adversity is. The best treatment for depression is not SSRIs or Prozac.
Right.
It's physical activity, prayer, meditation, and spirituality.
And diet.
And diet.
Yeah.
And diet. These are the things, the basics, the epigenetic factors
Yes.
that control everything we do. And well-tuned, you give yourself the best shot. 70% of the diseases we get are due to our choices, our environment, the four things I mentioned. 20 to 30% are genetically determined where we don't, it's going to happen, stuff happens. But we have 70%, we can control 70% of the bad things that we're going to develop or acquire. So with that, you know, I think the ketogenic diet and ways to enhance the ketogenic diet in a palatable way are incredibly important points.
So remarkable. Dr. Maroon, thank you so much for sharing so much information. Square One is a perfect example of how people can learn from you to not just survive, but really to thrive. And you are an unbelievable human being. Thank you for sharing.
My great pleasure, Naomi.
That's the reason why he's the Pittsburgh Steelers doctor, right?
Right? I mean, there's so much information, and he's a guy who really does walk the walk. From being a triathlete, one of the oldest Ironmen out there, just remarkable. Amazing.
He's living it and living it every day. Well, another thing people don't know about you is the fact that you really began this journey for yourself because of a very personal place.
Yeah.
And I really want people to have an opportunity to know that. So really, take a look at this, and you'll understand why Naomi does what she does. So Naomi, you've been on a journey of health and wellness, I'm gonna tell you, for what, 16 years? How long have you been doing this?
Well, I suffered from eczema when I was a little girl, so I've been on a health journey throughout my entire life, and that eczema stayed with me until my 20s. But my entire life is dedicated to how can I improve my own health and how can I share that information with other people.
You clearly impacted your own health when you were a small young girl. How did you slow down, you know, the ravages of eczema?
So with eczema, what happens is it's an autoimmune disorder. And when I was young, I didn't know what was going on. And so I would just wear clothing like this, where you couldn't see my body, you couldn't see the itchy, bleeding, pussing skin that was underneath it. And it's so ironic, Montel, because my father's a chemist, and my mother, as an artist, the two of them were very focused. I was born in Switzerland, and they were very focused on making sure that everything that I put into my body was good for me. And yet I was ravaged with this, you know, incredible amount of itchy eczema. And so I would keep my body covered at all times. When my friends would go to the swimming pool, whatever, I wouldn't go, or I just try to cover up. And I remember one day, it was the spring prom was coming, and I was really excited because I had my heart set on this guy by the name of Clovis Chester Young. And I knew that Clovis was my guy. And I wanted to go to the prom with him so badly. And it was also the time when my mother said to me, like, you know what? You shouldn't be covering yourself all the time. You don't need to wear long pants in the summer. Like, put some shorts on. Feel good about yourself. And I thought, you know what, she's right. I was 14 years old. And Clovis got a glimpse of my body and my skin, and he didn't invite me. Ugh. He didn't take me. And it was a defining moment of whatever it takes to deal with this autoimmune disorder, I'm gonna do. And my parents had brought me up with natural, homeopathic, all of the natural ways. I never used anything from a pharmacy. And at that point I said, you know what, I don't care, screw it. I'm gonna go get whatever it is. If it's steroids, I'm going to take it. I'm gonna go to a regular, conventional medical doctor and just do these things. And I did that for years, and it didn't get rid of it. Yes, it pushed it deeper into my body, deeper into my cells, but I didn't get rid of it. It was still there. And so it wasn't until I was in my 20s that I went to this amazing integrative Chinese doctor, and he said, okay, you have blood stagnation in your body. And he gave me these little Chinese herbs that were like little tiny pellets. And I took those and I did acupuncture. And over the course of, it was about a year and a half, my body peeled back like an onion. And the eczema came out of my body, and it was less and less, and my inflammation levels went down. And it was remarkable. And during my entire life, especially growing up in Europe, we eat a whole food diet. You know, GMOs are not allowed in many of the European countries. I never even knew what low fat or no fat was. We would take the cream off the milk and eat that, full butter, all the time. And I loved eating these high fats in the food that I ate.
And when you were growing up, I know for a fact you did not see the level of obesity you would see in the United States eating a full-fat diet, because our fake full-fat diet over here isn't really a full-fat diet.
That's right.
Yes.
No, there was no processed foods, nothing like that. And actually, I remember my father would give me a little bit of change every week. That would be my, like, you know, whatever it's called.
Allowance. Gotcha, okay.
And he would open up his desk, and he would show me the treats that I could have once a week. So I'd have my carob, or I'd have my little sesame crackers, and I didn't know processed food. I had never grown up with it. So if you fast forward, I've got these little Chinese herbs, and slowly but surely they're reducing the inflammation in my body, and I'm taking baths with these herbs, and I'm doing the acupuncture, and I can't believe that I've suppressed this eczema to the point where you can't, I mean, you barely see it. It barely shows up in my body.
I don't think I've ever seen it on you.
Yeah,
so that's the genesis of that drive that's deep down inside. And now your journey has been through when you did resveratrol. Right?
Yes, so what happened with these little Chinese herbs is, years fast forward, I met Dr. Erickson, who I introduced you to, and he did a whole panel of blood work, urine, all these things, because I'm getting ready to have a child. And he calls me into the office and he says, you know what, Naomi? You have no business getting pregnant right now because your heavy metal levels are off the chart.
Wow.
I'm like, what could possibly have created that kind of heavy metal toxicity in my body? And we trace it back, and it goes to those little Chinese herbs. And it was the soil and the way that they were grown that they had such heavy metal contamination. So here I was thinking I was doing something so good for myself, and I was in many ways, but I had created an issue in my body where I had such heavy metal toxicity in my body, I couldn't get pregnant. And so that put me on the quest where I needed to know from that moment forward where things come from. So I go to the source, I figure out, where does this ingredient come from before I would ever put it into my mouth again? Because I felt like an idiot, right? I'm a consumer, and I was consuming something that I thought was so good, and really, just because I didn't know the way it was produced and sort of like the whole supply chain thing, I had hurt myself. I had poisoned myself. And so that's what got me really excited in the idea around the science of resveratrol and the science of high fats and all of these brilliant researchers that are coming together and helping us to understand we are going back to nature, going back millions of years to the way we used to eat, and bring that into the forefront. My entire goal is to be able to understand it for myself, transform my health so I have the most energy and the most vitality, and really use that to share with so many other people. The feeling of satisfaction for me when I allow myself to eat what it is that my body is craving and then start to burn that fat for fuel has transformed my life. So I always believed in eating a lot of good fats. So I stay far away from the processed foods. So just taking the processed foods out of our diet, just getting rid of the high sugar, the added sugar, and removing that and taking it out of our diet is the very first step to reclaiming our health and allowing our body to start to use the fuel, the preferred fuel that it wants. So it's getting in harmony.
I almost want you to say that a second time, just so that people could hear it.
Yeah.
So this, again, this whole idea of trying to make people understand what we've done in the last now 110 years is shifted over mankind to a sugar diet, where mankind for thousands of years, millennia before, were always based on a fat diet.
Yes.
Naomi, thank you so much for just sharing this information with everybody. I mean, I think people are at a point right now where they're about to throw their hands up in the air, and now they have hope.
Thank you, Montel.
What an amazing story, Naomi. Really, everybody should really get an opportunity to hear your story. Well, see, that was an unbelievable start. For this first episode, you pulled together, like you have for every single one of our episodes, some of the top authorities in the entire world. Thank you.
Oh, and Montel, we have really only just begun.
Absolutely. So look, if you at home right now, you really enjoyed what you just watched, first off, what you need to do is make sure you can share this information with every single person you know. Number two, I want you to make sure you understand that we have 8 more episodes coming, so I want you to be here every single day. You know someone at home right now who's dealing with a chronic illness. You know someone who's home right now dealing with, I'd say, weight loss and weight issues. You know people who are dealing with self-esteem issues because they just don't feel good. This is an opportunity, just like you're going to do for yourself, to give them an eye-opening experience that's going to help them transform their life. Click on down below, share it with others, and make sure you watch us again tomorrow. We're out of time. This is going to be great.
Yes.
Great start. Thanks so much. Join us tomorrow. This is also about preventing sickness.
Right.
I don't want people to walk away from this and think that, you know, oh, Montel's telling people with MS what they should do. No. If I can do it with MS and you don't have anything, holy moly, what would happen to you if you did something, right? It's not trying to say to people, if you're sick, you need to do this. Why wait till you're sick?
First thing I tell people to do is add fat to every meal.
Add fat to every meal.
Don't take it, because everyone will be ready. Like, what are you going to take away from me?
Right.
What do I want that you're not going to let me eat? Nothing. Didn't change anything you're eating.
Yeah.
When people fast, their energy actually goes up if you measure it by their blood, their adrenaline, and all the good hormones that control our energy, no matter how they feel. Human growth hormone goes up, they actually put on a little bit of muscle, they start to burn the fat, the whole body goes into all these changes.
A lot of people today would look at ketosis as the end goal. I want to be in ketosis. I want to have a lot of ketones in my bloodstream. But the goal really is metabolic flexibility. The goal is to become really good at burning fat and to become so efficient that you don't need to eat a lot of food.